In this review, what I want to try and take you through are some of the broad demographic changes, which I've broken down here to just try and give you a sense of the overall changes that are occurring in Europe at this time. One of the biggest changes is an increase in population. Now, we've seen previously when I gave a lecture on demographic increase, we talked about how the population was booming. And so what you should see in this is not so much that the population had declined and now booming, but simply an acceleration of the boost in population that we've seen in European society. So why is that occurring? Well, we have continued increases in food production, we have increases in transportation capabilities, boosts in economic productivity. So again, those trends are accelerating. But at this time period, the biggest aid in the increase of population was not so much a rise in birth rates, which we'll get to that issue, but actually declining infant mortality and declining mortality rates in general. So the question is, how is that occurring? To give you a sense of the population boom, you're talking about by the end of the century a rise of nearly 100 million people in Europe. So what's bringing about this change? What's bringing about this development? Well, first, as I noted, was an increase in food productivity and the like. This is a continuation of that trends of the second agricultural revolution, but largely because we're talking about a decrease in mortality, was a rash of medical improvements, medical innovations. These range from the theoretical, namely the development of the germ theory of disease, leaving behind sort of the miasma theory of disease, where bad vapors or smells was the cause of disease, which pushes science forward in terms of diagnosis and treatment of disease, but any number of other developments. This is a time period in which Marie Curie is making her developments with X-ray technology. This is a time period in which you also have, say, improvements in medicine, as we'll talk about in the imperialism of Africa. This is a time in which quinine is used to help treat malaria. This is a time in which Joseph Lister will develop antiseptics to help make surgery safer. But in all this period, you're talking about a decrease in mortality and an increase in population. And so our next bullet point of a fertility crisis might seem odd. It might seem strange to say, well, with all of those improvements, certainly we should be having booming birth rates and the like. But in many cases, Europe felt that it was hit with a fertility crisis during this time period. So why do birth rates decline? Well, what we see playing out is something that seems to be quite common or almost predictable at this point. Namely, as Western civilization became more affluent, people started to have fewer and fewer children. Big booming populations tend to be in more farming and poorer societies, whereas as you get more affluent, more and more people have fewer and fewer kids. Now, the reasons for these are debatable, and any number of theories are provided for it. One that that I might put forth is think about the developments that we talked about in the division between home and work life. As people became more concerned with home life and a private sphere in which children would be developed, more and more people fixated on saying, well, let's have fewer kids and devote more attention to them so that this allows us to develop better children, if you will. Again, the concern with raising proper children and the right type of children led to a concern of, well, let's maximize our efforts by having fewer kids, but ensuring that we're developing them properly. Although in this regard, a fertility crisis also starts to have political ramifications, largely because this is an era in which you have the dominance of social Darwinian theory. Politicians start to become desperately concerned about fertility rates in their countries from the standpoint of thinking that as nations are competing politically, well, aren't we also competing in the realm of Darwinian evolution? Aren't we competing in the realms of fertility? And so, for example, as France watched its birth rate decline, more and more politicians started to speak of this crisis and become more concerned that France was falling behind its enemy, Germany, because they weren't producing enough kids. The last major element of demography is, of course, migration, though. This is a time period in which massive numbers of people are going to leave to go to the U.S. Other people are going to migrate and go to the empire. In many cases, these ideas of demographic change and migration start to become fused. A good example of this might be the state of Italy. So many southern Italians were leaving the new nation of Italy to travel to the United States that politicians started to become concerned. And so what they believed was, if we build an empire of our own in Africa, this will provide an outlet for our southern Italians to not flee our country, but instead migrate to these areas where they can have farmland and build homes, and thus we will not lose out on our people. This gives you a sense that these demographic trends, which I'm giving you a very broad overview, you should keep them in mind as we go through our next series of lectures, because these demographic trends are going to be in the minds of the people and the politicians as they're thinking through decisions about empire, as they're thinking about the growth in the economy and all the rest of these things. So just keep these broad trends in mind as we go through the rest of this module.